He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew what was.
Welcome to this special edition of Islands at War. My name is Nick Lahure. There's no Keith this week. Just instead, I'm talking with Jenny O'Brien about The Book of Lost Children, her latest book, absolutely brilliant book about the occupation. It is fiction, but it's based on some facts, and it is pretty darn good. So I hope you enjoy this chat. Katie Roger joined us as well to help join in the conversation. So I hope you enjoy. So, Jenny, you've almost forgotten about this book already now, haven't you? We're talking about The Book of Lost Children, which is your latest book that is out, but I know you've been working hard on another book as well. So it's going to be a bit tricky to remember what's what.
Yes, it is. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. Yesterday, I finished the second draft of my second historical novel, so my head is actually between Guernsey, London and Paris at the moment. And so it is going to be difficult, but let's see what I can do, because I did write the thing, so I should be able to remember some of it.
And it was a bit of a departure for you. You've just mentioned that you're working on your second book that's historical based. The Book of Lost Children was your first book that you'd written that was sort of based on historical fact and that you did lots of research for, as opposed to knowing lots of different ways of murdering people, which I found out when I interviewed you for the Guernsey Literary Festival.
I had a run of thrillers. I was lucky enough to get a book contract with HarperCollins and then another book contract with Storm Publishing. And I was just crimed out, I suppose. So 10 crime thrillers, bang, 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 bang. I wanted to do something different. And it was coming up to the 80th anniversary of Liberation. It wasn't a book I was ever going to write. I was never going to write a book set in Guernsey. There's lots of really good books that are written about the Channel Islands and particularly about the occupation. It's that unique snapshot of history that people are interested in. And then I thought, well, if I don't do it now, I'm not going to do it. So I looked around for a story that hadn't been written. As I said, I'm not going to write a book somebody else has written either, a story. And I came across something in the Prio Library about what the nurses were up to in the occupation hospital, the emergency hospital then, which is now the Catal Hospital, which is sadly closed. And I thought, well, that's a story. I just took it from there, really. So 3 months of research to get a plot and then 3 months to write it.
And we've got Katie here as well. Both of us picked up the book and just couldn't put it down.
No, I was getting quite cross because I wanted to go to sleep. I've got to finish it.
And I was in a very similar situation. And I don't read fiction. I never read fiction. I just don't have time. And I just picked it up and I just couldn't put it.
But that's the writer's job. You know, my job as a writer is to give the reader the best experience. That's what writers do. Mm-hmm. And if you'd gone to sleep, I wouldn't have been doing my job. You know, I had somebody in the underground in, I think it was Barcelona, who messaged me and she'd missed 2 of her stops because she was reading one of my books.
Oh, wow.
And that's my job.
Yeah.
You know, I had somebody else and she was on her honeymoon. And when she got back, she said, I was reading your book till 3 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, okay then, perhaps you... But, you know, that's my job done. So there are things I use, tricks, I suppose you call them. If you're writing for as long as I have, I've been writing fiction for 20 years, you learn tricks of the trade as to how to get people to continue reading. Because if they like a book, they'll tell their friends.
Yeah.
So that's nothing necessarily to do with the story. That's to do with the mechanics of writing a book.
But I think the story as well. It was something different, or very different to what you've written in the past, for sure. And I enjoyed your fiction, your crime fiction books as well. But yeah, the story itself is
it's a story that's based on fact.
Absolutely. And this is what Nick had said to me. Everything that's happened in that book, it could have actually happened.
Yeah, it could have. I've deviated, so that it's a work of fiction.
Yeah.
So the main character, Evelyn Nightingale, is fictitious, but everything around her isn't. So the matron of the hospital, Matron Raby, the doctors, one of the doctors was Dr. Rose, which I wanted to write about him, but I didn't have his family's permission. So I called him Dr. Holly. But actually, recently I've been in touch with his grandson, and he knows about the book and he's interested to read it. So I've tried to be true to the facts as much as I can, even down to the weather, Nick.
Yes.
Yes, you pointed that out.
As we discussed, I thought I'm bound to find something wrong in this book somewhere. It wouldn't be right. And because I myself have written a book about escapes from Guernsey, I'm very familiar and can bore the pants off of anybody with what the weather's like on any particular time during the occupation. And you got it all right.
And trust me, if there was something to find, who'd have found it? You don't watch a war film with Nick.
No.
It is a nightmare because he will pick holes in, that didn't happen, that your book. He's just like, no, she even got the weather right.
But it's the same with me with nursing for so many years. I don't watch nursing things at all. Yeah, because they're cringeworthy, even though they have experts on. They still don't get it right. I know you can't but then it's fiction. Yeah, it's not fact. If you're watching something true like drama, well then, I don't really want to be watching somebody bleeding all over an emergency room floor. Thank you, because I've done that. This is for pleasure. Yeah, so I don't watch them.
Yeah.
As you've mentioned, the book is about nursing, but I think you also described it as being about motherhood as well, to a certain extent.
Yes, basically. It's motherhood in all its guises, and that includes people who don't have children. So there's a nun in it, Sister Teresa, who was a nun at the convent in the Coat Hills. She's fictitious, but there were nuns at the Coat Hills during the time. It was a working convent. My character, Teresa, or Therese, if it's pronounced in French, she lost her husband during the First World War. And then she chose to go into the church. Evelyn, my main character, she lost her fiancé. Again, she was one of these war spinsters there was quite a few of them around after the First World War. And although she would have loved children, she didn't have them. She became a teacher instead. There was another woman who couldn't have children. And then when she became pregnant, her baby died. And then there were women who looked at a man, whether they were German or whether they were Guernsey, and they popped out children like peas. There were children that were abandoned because they didn't want them. Their husbands may have been at war and they found out they were pregnant. There were abandoned children. So it encapsulates motherhood, but it's also for those people who decide not to have children because they don't want them. They can't have children because their husband, partner have died. They can't have children because physically they're unable to have children. And then those that have loads of children. That's it in a nutshell, with lots of twiddly bits around and factually correct, hopefully.
And I must confess that since reading the book, it made me think about aspects of the occupation that I was sort of aware of, but not really thought that much about what the nurses and doctors went through and how they helped a lot of people out that perhaps wouldn't have survived.
I think they were key, basically. They did have deaths in Guernsey during the war. They had quite a few deaths. They would have a young man, a 20, 30-year-old, coming in, and he might have trapped his finger in a greenhouse or different machinery. And he died because although antibiotics, penicillin, was around in the early 1940s, it wasn't around in Guernsey, except if you were at the German hospital. They had access to it. We didn't. I say we as the royal we, not me, because I'm Irish. So they did what they could. There was only, I read in the Prior Library, I came across this article, there was only one maternal death in the whole of the war, which is amazing.
That's
I wish I'd actually taken a copy of it, because I'd have to go through the upstairs of the Prior Library to find that one reference. I'm not going to do that.
That is astounding.
What they did was, when women were at a certain time in their pregnancy, say 6, 7 months,
Yeah.
whatever that time was. I'm not sure what that was. Their husbands would have to drop them off, and they'd have to have the rest of their pregnancy in hospital because there were no cars, and you can't have a 6, 7 month pregnant woman getting there on the back of a cart being ridden with her husband on the bicycle in front. That wasn't going to happen. So that was arranged by the powers that be at the hospital. They had to be there. There were no home births because the doctors, the midwives couldn't attend them.
See, that's something that's intrigued me because my grandparents were here during the occupation, and my gran had 5 babies during the occupation, 1 each year. So she was in hospital. She would have been in hospital.
She would have been
a
in
lot.
hospital.
And I'm thinking, because my granddad wasn't the type of man that would have looked after kids.
Yeah.
Very happy to pop out, but that's not his job. So I want to find out as to who was looking after my aunties and uncles, because it was.
But it was different in those days, wasn't it? I mean, these days it's all about health and safety. In those days, children would just let go.
Yeah,
run,
absolutely.
which 99% of the time was fine. But then you get the odd tragedy. I was reading about I think she was called Hammond. Was it Roselle Hammond? I'm not sure about that name, but a little girl in Jersey. She was 4 or 5, and she found her way towards the sea, and there was a bomb. And then there was another one in St. Martin's on the beach. A boy, a young lad, 5 or 6, who found his way onto the beach, and he died because the bomb. The beaches were all mined. So there were tragedies, but there weren't that many for children in those days. And the Germans, well, you'll know this more than I will, but at the start they were good. They were family men, and they weren't going to harm people. They were there. A lot of them didn't want to be here. And children, they'd give them sweets and stuff.
Yeah. There's so many stories about that I've seen where people came back after the war. They wanted to actually come and bring their wife or other members of their family here to come and see where they were and how lucky they were.
The pleasure for me of writing this story is a lot of the conversations I have. We're actually sitting in the yacht club at the minute, which is where I come after swimming for a cup of tea, just really so the audience knows where we're sitting. We're looking out over a view of Castle Cornish, which I've actually got my back to it. But Nick, occasionally you are looking at the view instead of looking at me, which is great. But we have my friends are a little bit older than me, and some of them were born here and during the war, I should say. And we have conversations every morning, and the occupation features heavily. We were talking about this very thing this morning. About one of them used to be a tour guide, and she was telling me about one of the German officers had come over in the 50s, and it wasn't her. She was too young for that. But one of her friends who was a tour guide here said that he stood up at the end of the tour and he said, "Well, I was here, and this, that, and the other, and if you remember this." But these are my morning conversations that I have. So although I never wanted to write about a book set in Guernsey during the occupation because it had been done, it was probably leading towards that way because of all the conversations I have, because it's part of, I suppose, who I am, who I'm developing into.
But the story that you've written is like you said, it's not a story that had ever been told before. And yes, it is fiction, obviously, but it's a very different book to other stories that have been written.
It was always going to be, though. And I don't read a lot of historical fiction, so I don't know necessarily what other people are writing about, because I try not to. So I used to read a huge amount of crime fiction when I was younger. My husband, Alan, he used to despair because, it would be the really nasty stuff. Yeah. And then I had my children, and my oldest son's called Joel, and I was sitting, he was in a bassinet beside me, and I was reading this horrible book set in France, and the boy was abducted, 11-year-old called Joel. And I had 10 years, never read a crime fiction book, started writing crime. I didn't really read crime fiction books, which I suppose was to my advantage because I didn't know in that gap what other people were doing. Yeah. So people say to me, my crime fiction, that the method I use to murder people is quite original, but I'm not copying people because it comes out of my head as opposed to being inspired by because I don't read a huge amount of crime fiction. I'll read some psychological thrillers, one of my best friends is called Valerie Keogh. She's the top-selling crime fiction writer for Kindle, and I read her books. But apart from that, there's few. I'll read more cozy crime now if I'm reading anything. Yeah, or romances. I read romances. But something different, something palate cleansing, because what I write is quite traumatic. The Book of Lost Children is a traumatic read. You know, it's not a romance.
You certainly don't sugarcoat it.
No,
It's true.
It's true. And what happened in Guernsey during the occupation was horrible. You know, we talk about the nice Germans, but it was fundamentally horrible and tragic for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that's what I've tried to portray.
And certainly you don't hold back on the main nasty character, shall we say, in the book is entirely believable because of the way he behaves is not dissimilar to, you know, some of the other rather unpleasant characters that were here in the island.
War creates monsters, doesn't it? You know, they might not appear to be monsters when they're starting out, but something triggers in their brain. I have to say, though, I've left... I don't want people to think if my books are full of trigger warnings, because they're not, because I lead the reader down a path and then I stop at the end and there'll be a big brick wall. Yeah. And then on the next page, you will find yourself on the other side of the brick wall. I don't tend to write graphic scenes, but you'll know where I'm going.
Yeah, you get the idea.
You get the idea.
It's implied.
It's implied. Yeah. And I don't write sex scenes. Is there any sex scene? No, there isn't. No.
Remember,
there's something that's implied, but there's it's never on the page because you know your imagination's much better than that. It is for that.
But also, I like the way that the hopefully I'm giving too much away here, but the book interacts with Dublin. There's a storyline going on in Dublin as well, which crosses over into Guernsey.
I think,
and that's slightly. That takes the edge off the nastier bits,
and that's why I did it. You know, I've been criticised by some people because they would have preferred the whole story set in Guernsey, but for me that would have been too harrowing. You know, it was harrowing enough when I was writing it. I mean, when I finished that book, I just sat down and I didn't cry, but I felt as if I could just bang my head against a wall, and you know, because it was difficult to write, and if it's difficult to write, it's going to be difficult to read. So that's why I decided to slot in a different stream, a different strand, if you like. So there is a softer strand going through it, but it echoes what happens during the main part, but it softens it a little bit. And the reader has a chance to go, oh, thank goodness for that. Yeah. Before the pace picks up again.
And then you're back in Guernsey.
And then you're back in Guernsey. And but that was my decision as a writer. Again, going back to trying to give my readers a good experience.
I think it worked really, really well because you go from, like you say, that one of the harrowing bits to then a slightly lighter bit, but it's still related to
the harrowing,
harrowing bits and whatever, and the relationship that the characters in Ireland have compared to, you know, with the main character in the book. Yeah, they've got very similar relationships with their fathers, for example, and that gives that continuity through it. And I just think it works really, really well. And as I say, if you'd have told me before I picked the book up that I was going to sit there and finish it in a couple of days, that I wouldn't have believed you.
I've never seen you in the 3 years we've been together read a fiction book.
I just think it tells the story so well, and also from a fact point of view, it made me think there's an awful lot out there that's never been written about to do with the doctors and the nurses and what they did. I just think this is kind of flagged.
You know, everybody was on rations, you know, and they kept cutting the rations and cutting the rations. And one of the things I sort of said, one of the doctors said in the book, I can't remember what exactly the wording I used, but you know, if they cut my rations anymore, I'll be giving them food back, sort of thing. That's the line that appeared. But there were some people, the brothel workers, that were on extra rations. But the nurses who were doing 12-hour shifts, they were on the cut rations like everybody else. And the senior figures looking in charge of the hospital went to the authority and said, look, our nurses, our doctors are working, 24 hours 7, and they still wouldn't give them any extra food. They were starving. Nobody walked out of Guernsey overweight. There would have been nobody having to go on Mounjaro or Ozempic or whatever. You would have 15 stone men, and they would be 7 stone when they left Guernsey. There was nobody.
A lot of the diarists. That's one of the things I've noticed is as the occupation goes on, they actually start to become more and more obsessed with their weight.
Yeah, but also obsessed with food.
Yeah.
Food mattered. We go to the supermarket now and we moan if the boat hasn't been in or if there's been a crisis with a co-op and scammers.
But we all know we've got backup in the fridge. Yeah, there's something there.
There's
it might be not what you want, but
there's always something. Baked beans at the back that might be 3 years out of date, but you're not going to starve. But there was nothing.
Yeah, absolutely nothing. And as you said, the doctors and nurses, they didn't even get, because there were kind of 2 grades of rations for the civilian population. If you were involved in some sort of manual labour, or I think they described it as hard labour, then you got a certain extra allowance of rations. I would have thought that, the doctors and nurses that are doing all these long shifts, they're being called out to emergencies and things like that. You'd have at least thought they'd have got that, but they didn't.
No.
And it's just...
And not only the emotional toll on them as well as the physical toll must have been, and the fact that they're, emotionally they're dealing with some horrible situations in a hospital. And then they're worrying about the fact that they've got no food, but they're also worrying about the fact their patients have nothing. That's,
I think the only reason they survived was because they had the farm on site and they had the Guernsey milk. Yeah. Which I don't know whether your audience knows, but Guernsey milk is very high fat content, one of the highest, isn't it? Yeah. So it would have been calorific. And what they used to do was up to D-Day, when they still had access to France, a boat used to go over and used to bring back pasta. And they'd have macaroni pudding. I remember speaking to the son of one of the nurses, and he said my mother could never stomach a milk pudding after. She would have thrown it at the wall as opposed to eating it. And she was quite mild-mannered, but, that's all they had.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've met numerous people over the years that there were various things that they just could not stomach eating anymore after the occupation because they just had so much of it that they were sick of it. To various different things. Ironically, in Sark, there were a number of people who were reported at the end of the occupation as having been sick of lobster. And that's a slightly, but I'd imagine probably if you were eating lobster nearly every day, then you probably would be absolutely sick and tired of it. But
it's interesting that they were able to catch them though, but I suppose they were allowed out on the boats if there was a German on the boat in Sark, right? I was reading about it this morning, actually. So I suppose they would have.
Yeah, and because Sark being so small as well, there's not that much land to cultivate.
Yeah.
So, they were very reliant on that. But I just thought that's an unusual thing for people to be sick
of lobster.
But the book has... some really interesting characters in there, and some of them. Well, I mean, the main German character, frankly, if he'd been stood in the same room as me, I'd want to punch him on the nose because he is pretty horrible. But as said earlier, entirely plausible that someone like that would have been around.
Yeah.
What was the most difficult thing about writing the book?
For me, it was emotional. So it's very different. And I didn't realise this during the first draft. So it did cause me a problem when my editor got her hands on it. Because I didn't realise that writing crime fiction was so very different to writing historical fiction. And I didn't have enough emotion in it. My writing is quite pared back. So I won't spend a page describing the scenery, for instance. I want to get into the nitty-gritty of the story. I'm not really interested in the, it's lovely looking behind that castle, but my back's to it. Yeah. I wanted to get to the story. So my when I write, it's character-led and it's story-led as opposed to anything else. So I found it difficult to get the right emotional level. So the second draft, after my editor had got her hands on it, was really difficult for me to appreciate where she was going and adding the extra layers because, if a policeman finds a dead body or a detective is trying to find out who's killed such and such, it's not the only dead body they've ever seen. They've had a 30-year career behind them and it's routine to a certain extent. Whereas I wasn't writing routine things here, and I found that quite difficult. And I found it quite upsetting. As I said, when I finished it, I was a bit of a wreck. And that's why, because it was very different to what I normally write. So the next one, the one I've just finished now, I've done it right the first time. It's like going back to school, isn't it? I mean, you're stuck now. But, a book has to be right. So, and that's why writers have editors.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, was it one of the reviews that mentioned that you needed a box of tissues whilst you...
Most of the reviews mention that you need a box
reading the book. And that's certainly
absolutely.
something I'd agree with.
Yeah,
Agree with.
Yeah. No, I should get shares in Kleenex. Or,
You should do, definitely.
get to advertise it.
Jenny O'Brien is sponsored by
Kleenex, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much covered things. Thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Jenny.
you.
I look forward to the next book coming out.
Thank you.
Definitely.
I'm aware of a few little snippets of information about it, and it sounds absolutely fantastic. So I'm very much looking forward to that coming out.
Thank you.
Thanks. As I said during the interview, highly recommend this book. Really, really good. I don't really read fiction, particularly if it's based on historical fact, but this was an absolutely brilliant book. I'll be putting some links in the show notes, so you have various options for where you can go and buy this. Of course, feel free to support your local bookshop. I know the bookshops here in Guernsey are selling it. I'm sure that all across wherever you are listening, you will be able to find it in a local bookshop as well. For those who are in Guernsey on the 8th of June 2025, myself and Joe May are running a walking tour around St. Peter's Port called The Road to Freedom. It's a brand new tour celebrating Liberation 80, and we'd love it if you wanted to come along and join us. The cost is £10 if you want to come along. It's on the Sunday morning. I'll put links in the show notes so you can find out how you can book for that tour. Lots of photographs to show you as we go around, talk about our families during the occupation, and looking at some of the key sites around St. Peter's Port that were involved both during Liberation Day and throughout the occupation of the islands. Perhaps a few insights into some of the things from my forthcoming book as well. So please do have a look and see if you'd like to join us. We'd love to see you along there. Thanks again to Jenny and Katie as well for her contribution. And we'll see you next week. Cheery.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone.